Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Retrocution. Today I'm going to show you how to take the PlayStation Classic and install a Raspberry Pi 3 inside of it. I've already modded this PlayStation Classic that I'm holding right now, and as you can see, it looks completely stock from the outside. But if you look under the hood, you can see this baby's not exactly street legal. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through the entire process to install a Raspberry Pi 3 into your PlayStation Classic. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a brand new PlayStation Classic. The way they package this thing is funny, man. It's like those Russian dolls. It's like a box inside of a box inside of a box. It's like they spent more time designing the box than the actual console. I'm retarded. Let's go ahead and open it up and remove the board. Just slide these little memory card covers off. And you can go ahead and remove the heatsink and throw it in the trash. Alright, so to make everything fit, we're going to have to go ahead and cut this part of the board off. There's a few ways you could do this. You could use a Dremel. You could maybe use a mini hacksaw. But I just got this awesome mini table saw from China, and I'm going to use this bad boy. So I'm going to be very careful doing this. I don't want this to turn into a live leak video. It's a little sketchy because I'm at a weird angle because of the camera. But I'm just going to be very, very careful. And you guys do the same at home. Alright, now that we got our board cut, we're going to go ahead and move on to probably the most challenging part of the entire project. And that's removing all of these ports from the Raspberry Pi. So you can try to desolder them, but I've found through experience the best way to remove them is just to very carefully cut them off while taking your time to make sure you don't damage any of the nearby components. So I get it started by just clipping the two ends here and then lifting the shielding up. And once you get under the shielding, all the pins are right there for you to cut. So I'm gonna just go ahead and fast forward through this because it's a pretty long process. And you really don't want to rush when you do this because you could destroy your Pi. And once you get to the end here, you can just rock the shield back and forth and it'll eventually just break off. You can see I got the first one off, and it doesn't look so bad. Just gotta be very careful. Alright, so I've got the second USB port removed, and as you can see, it looks pretty good. It looks bad while you're doing it, but the results are good. You gotta just be very careful. So to remove this Ethernet port, I'm just gonna work my cutters under the seams on the sides, and eventually you'll be able to just pull the shielding right off of it. And once you get the shielding off, you just wanna go ahead and start cutting this plastic jack apart. It's gonna take a while to get to the pins, but you just gotta keep working at it. And once you see the heads of the pins, you can go ahead and use a small screwdriver to pry it up, and then you'll have access to get your cutters under there and cut all the pins. And as you can see, it looks really good. Very minimal scratching. Now our Pi 3 looks like it went on a diet. So that made a really huge mess. Just gonna clean this shit up real quick. Alright, so that was pretty much the hard part of this project. So now we're ready to go ahead and do some work on the shell. We're going to go ahead and cut this post and this support piece here. But when you're cutting these, be very careful, go slow, and don't cut too close to the bottom of the case. Because if you do, you can very easily put a stress mark in the plastic, and it'll be a white mark that you'll be able to see. So be very careful and take your time. And we don't need it to be flush, we just need it to be lower than this lip right here. So again, just remove this and be very careful. So after we're finished with those, we need to go ahead and remove this little bit of plastic from this screw post between the front controller ports. You see this slot right here? It was like it was made for a Pi. Look how nice the Pi fits in there. And you see it has a little bit of pressure when it's pushed down. That's really good because when everything's mounted in here, it helps keep it in place. So let's go ahead and get our new HDMI port installed. I got this adapter on Amazon and I'll go ahead and include a link in the description for it. It's the perfect size for this project. It's got a little bit of a lip on it, so we're just gonna trim it off real quick. And you'll notice when you try to fit it, it doesn't quite fit. That's because of these two plastic tabs in the way. So we're just gonna go ahead and cut them out. Now our port lines up perfectly. So to mount it in place, we're gonna use some glue. So I went ahead and put some scratch marks around the port for the glue to hold on to. If you can find this brand of super glue, this is the best stuff out there. So go ahead and apply some glue around the edge of the port, but be very careful not to get any inside. So after we got it holding in place, we're gonna go ahead and just apply a little bit more glue around the edges for extra strength. And if you're wondering how strong this is, check this out. I'm pulling on it pretty hard. We'll go ahead and plug a HDMI cable into it. Solid. So now we're ready to go ahead and fit our Pi inside of our shell. So just go ahead and slide it into that slot. You gotta use a little bit of finesse, but it'll fit. And once you get that in place, go ahead and plug the HDMI cable into the Pi. And you can see once everything is in there, the HDMI cable fits perfectly against that post, and it does a really good job of holding everything in place. So our PlayStation Classic board will just sit right on top of our Pi. And you can see when they're together, there's plenty of space in there. They're not touching each other at all. Now if you plug the power into the PlayStation Classic board, you'll probably hear some sizzling and notice the chips are burning hot. So we need to go ahead and kill this board by cutting all these traces right here to ensure that there's no power getting to any of these chips. And for good measure, I'm just going to go ahead and cut through these traces here too. Want to make sure this board is dead. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of solder to the ground plane here, and that'll be our new ground connection. This area of the board here is where we'll tap in to get our 5 volts from the USB power connector. I ran out of black wire for the ground, so blue's just gonna have to do. So when I make power wires, I like to just use my drill to twist them up together. Makes it look a little cleaner and more professional. So after we made our connections, you can see we're just passing the 5 volts through the USB connector to these 2 wires. So we're going to go ahead and solder them onto the pins on our Pi. And if you connect 5 volts to one of the 5 volt pins on the GPIO, that'll give power to the Pi. Sorry for my hand being in the way. So now that we've made our power connection, let's go ahead and test it. Yep, you can see that red indicator LED on the Pi. It's getting power. And now both of our boards are sharing a common ground, which will make the rest of our wiring a lot easier. So you see the bottom 2 pins on each momentary switch are connected to ground. So since both of our boards have the same ground, they're already grounded to our Raspberry Pi. So we'll just need to attach 1 wire to each of the momentary switches. And it's always a good idea to check continuity as you work to make sure you're not shorted anywhere. This will help save you a lot of troubleshooting time later. So now we're ready to wire up the USB connectors. Just to have a little bit more space, I like to remove these 2 electrolytic capacitors right here. You can just twist them right off. So before we try to solder onto these pins, I'm just going to add a little bit of flux and tin them up. Now to wire these, I'm just going to use a small piece of IDE cable. This is the best wire to use for these USB ports. And as always, check continuity. Now I'm going to go ahead and install a new LED. You can try to wire onto the existing LED, but I choose to just burn it off and put a new one in. This is the only hot glue on the entire project. And since our boards are grounded together, I'm going to go ahead and just solder the ground wire from the LED right to this ground plane right here. Now all our wiring on the PlayStation Classic board is done, and we're ready to start connecting all of it to the Pi. So we're going to go ahead and connect our LED first. This goes on to pin 8. And I will be including a diagram, so don't worry if you're having a hard time following along. So let's go ahead and connect our on and off button to pin 5. And as always, check continuity. Make sure you're not shorted out anywhere. So our reset button and the open and close button on the PlayStation Classic shell have to go to 2 pins each. So I made these little jumpers to make it easier to connect them. Here's a better look at how I made the jumpers. So I'll go ahead and connect this one on. And again, all the pins are going to be in the wiring diagram. So don't worry if you're having a hard time following along. So now I'll just go ahead and bend it out of the way. And before we attach the wires to the jumpers, we're just going to slide a little piece of heat shrink onto each of the wires. So after making our connections, we'll go ahead and slide the heat shrinks on to cover those joints to make sure they don't get shorted out against anything. So we're almost done. We just have to connect our USB. But before we do that, we're going to actually go ahead and mount the PlayStation Classic board into the shell. It makes connecting the USB wires a lot easier. So make sure none of the wires are getting pinched. Just move them out of the way and go ahead and screw the PlayStation Classic board down. So our USB wires actually connect to the pads in the exact orientation they're already facing. So before we connect them, we're going to go ahead and tin the pads. Now just be very careful not to touch your soldering iron to the PlayStation Classic shell while you're doing this. Now this is really important. I'm sorry I didn't talk about it earlier in the video, but even though these momentary switches don't show any continuity between ground and the top pins, the GPIOs still get grounded when attached to them. So the way around this is to just slice all the traces going to the top pads until they're fully isolated. So one thing that'll happen is if you don't do this, as soon as you turn your Pi on and it starts to boot, the shutdown script will just go off by itself because the buttons are grounded. So just go ahead and slice through all these traces. And the way you can test it is just to disconnect your wire and touch it to the pad. If it's initiating the shutdown script or any of the other scripts that the other two buttons control, then you need to just cut the traces some more. Alright, once you got that figured out, you're ready to close this bad boy up. And you'll notice the case doesn't want to close all the way. No problem, we just gotta cut out these two plastic tabs here and remove a little bit of the plastic lip as well. Once you got that removed, this baby will fit nice and flush, just like original. So let's go ahead and install our little memory card USB covers. Close this baby up and test it out. So let's go ahead and switch it on. And if you're familiar with Raspberry Pi, you know there's a bunch of text that's usually on the screen. I've configured it to be hidden. That's such a nice sound. Okay, our USB is working. Let's go ahead and test out controller port number 2. Make sure that port's working. Yep. So let's try out our other buttons. We'll go ahead and try the open button. And yeah, that opens the RetroArch menu like it's supposed to. And if you got through this build, you go ahead and have yourself a drink, just like this guy. The emulation feels really great. I don't feel any kind of lag or anything like that. The picture quality is really good. I have the bilinear filter turned on right now in the settings. So let's go ahead and try the reset button. And yeah, that worked great. Took us right back to our games list. So let's go ahead and try to power it down. And yeah, that works just fine. So I'm planning on uploading my base image of this that you'll be able to download and just put on an SD card. You'll have to add your own games, but the GPIO buttons and everything like that will already be set up for you. And I'll also have a wiring diagram available that you can download that'll have a clear picture of where you have to make all your connections. And if you have any trouble or you have a question, just go ahead and leave it in the comments and I'll do my best to respond to it as soon as I can. And lastly guys, if you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Please leave a like, please subscribe to my channel. I've got a lot of great projects in the works to show you all, and you're not going to want to miss them, so stay tuned.